going to turn it over to Amy.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Amy. I want to say welcome to everyone. It's wonderful to see such a packed room tonight. I know there's another really important event that was going on tonight across town that I think is going to be equally packed. So it's been just like an incredible, amazing week of organizing, of seeing people in the streets after a really pretty shitty result in the election. So yeah, I think we're good. So I wanted to start just by welcoming everybody and also saying that no matter what you did last Tuesday, no matter who you voted for, whether you voted or not, that all kind of doesn't really matter now, because at this point, what we really face is an urgent task of building a unified resistance against Trump's agenda and against the far-right forces that have been emboldened by his victory. And this unity that I'm talking about is, what we should say, it's distinct from the types of unity that the upper echelons of the Democratic Party have been calling for. The type of unity that Clinton called for when she urged us in her concession speech to give Trump a chance to lead. The type of unity Obama called for when he said that we're now all rooting for Trump's success. I don't know who he was talking, it was not talking about me. And then even Bernie Sanders, who said to the degree that Mr. Trump is serious about pursuing policies that improve the lives of working families in this country, I and other progressives are prepared to work with him. I want to call out that statement because we know that Trump is not serious about pursuing policies that improve the lives of working people here in this country or anywhere on this planet. Thus far, with only 1 week in as president-elect, Trump has announced plans to launch mass deportations of 2 to 3 million undocumented immigrants, to follow through on his campaign promise of registering Muslims, and has appointed alt-right demagogue Stephen Bannon as a senior advisor. So we are not going to stand idly by and wait for atrocities to be committed before we mount a resistance to that, for indeed they have already begun. Trump's election has emboldened some of the worst elements of American society to the point where we've seen a spike in hate crimes over this past week that's even more pronounced than what happened in the Islamophobic hysteria in the days following 9/11. So there have been calls for an all-hands-on-deck approach to organize for midterm elections so that the Democrats will have the power to fight back against Trump's agenda. But the truth is the Democrats do not need to wait until midterms to fight back. They have the power to fight Trump now. What they lack is the political will to do so. So let's contrast the Democrats' leadership stance today with that of the Republicans after Obama's election back in 2008, when despite having fewer congressional seats than Democrats hold coming out of last Tuesday's election, they launched a relentless campaign of obstruction against Obama's agenda, particularly the American Care Act. Let's also contrast their stance with the spontaneous mobilization of thousands of people in city streets, in campuses, in high schools, and on social media over this past week. I think here in Portland, we saw, 4 straight days of protests where at least 150 people came out, all sort of with different angles on the protest, but, action nonetheless. At Baylor University, where after a black student was assaulted and called the N-word by a Trump supporter, nearly 300 people the next morning showed up to walk her to school, to walk her, to her classes from her dorm room. And then I think one of my favorite actions that I saw happening over this past week was there was a march in Los Angeles that passed by a deportation center, and there was someone in the crowd who knew that was a deportation center, and so they called up to it, and there was this incredible moment where people started chanting to the people who were incarcerated inside, who then started flashing back their reading lights and tapping on the cells of their jail. And it was just this incredible expression of connection and shared struggle, just directly against the types of walls that Trump says he wants to continue to build more of. And just a really, really, really incredible moment. And I think the other amazing thing about so many of the struggles that have been coming up over this past week is that for many people, this is their very first time protesting. So it's some of the first time for anybody getting out in the streets, which is also something we should be really excited about. So unlike the Democratic Party, ordinary people have shown that they have an immense political will to fight. But I think what we lack is a strong understanding of our political power, of how to organize it and exercise it to its fullest potential. So if we're going to mount a fight back against Trump and the forces that led to his rise, we first need a clear-sighted understanding of what drove so many people to support him in the first place. And the fact that millions of people cast their ballot for someone as vile as Trump has been an enormous point of despair for, I think, a lot of people that I know. Even for those who've taken heart in the fact that he didn't actually win a majority of the votes in this country. I think there's still this question that remains for so many of us, like, how could such a large part of the electorate turn a blind eye to his racism, to his sexism, his ableism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, the list goes on. Were they really turning a blind eye and voting for him in spite of it? Or was this an act of millions of Americans showing their true colors, actively embracing an agenda of blatantly white supremacist, nativist machismo? And I've seen more than a few people on social media and at protests decrying Trump's voters as lacking in humanity, unsympathetic to the plight of oppressed people, or so blinded by privilege that they are unable to comprehend the fear that marginalized groups feel in the face of a Trump's presidency. And no doubt, the politics of hate and fear were a constant feature of Trump's campaign and a rallying cry for some of his most diehard supporters on the far right. But we can't chalk Trump's win up to this alone. Another major theme in this election, which found popular expression on both sides of the aisle, was a massive anti-establishment sentiment. The Republican candidate that emerged from the primaries was basically like Washington outsider incarnate, while the Democratic candidate represented the all too familiar status quo. And this isn't to say that racism, sexism, xenophobia, and so on weren't central dynamics of this election, or that they aren't central dynamics of American politics every day of our lives. But we do need to question whether they were the central motivating factor for most people who voted for Trump if we're going to mount a fight back against those types of, against the rise of someone like Trump. And for instance, we can look at Wisconsin exit polls where 49% of voters, this is a state that went for Trump, where 49% of voters said that they thought the US had lost jobs to free trade, which we know is a major talking point of his campaign. But 58% agreed that immigrants do more to help the economy than to hurt it, which is a break from Trump's rhetoric. An even sharper break, 7 out of 10 Wisconsin voters said that immigrants working in this country illegally should be offered a chance to apply for legal status. So there's something else, I think, going on here besides, just the politics of hate motivating people to get out to the polls. Even more striking, I think, is a story that is even closer to home for us. So about an hour and a half north of here in Mexico, Maine, a place where registered Democrats outnumber Republicans 2-1, where Obama won 67% of the votes in 2012, which is his election year. This isn't the year of hope and change. This is his re-election year. Trump won in Mexico this year 50% to Clinton's 42%. So by all accounts, this was a town that should have been in the bag for the Democrats. So what happened? And I think to understand why this shift came to be, you need to know a little bit more about Mexico than just the kind of Democrat-Republican breakdown. So like Millinocket or Jay, Mexico is a mill town. There's a ski resort nearby too, but if you live there, you pretty much either work at the mill or the mountain. There's some other jobs around, at small businesses, schools, or at the hospital. But the mill really is the only year-round driving economic force for a large portion of the people who live there. And I know this in part because I grew up about 20 minutes away, and it's the town where my mom still works. If you've been in Maine for a while, you probably know the declining paper industry has been doing a number on towns like these. They've seen an enormous amount of job loss as mills have downsized or closed altogether. And as a result, there's also been a rising proportion of people who have had to rely on welfare to get by. And there's also been a rise in people relying on opiates like oxy and heroin, not to get by, but perhaps to just let go. Here's an excerpt from a recent Press Herald article on Maine's mill towns in this election last Tuesday. In addition to the massive shift in Mexico, Rumford also favored Trump by a 50 to 41% margin after having supported Obama in 2012. Millinocket, which used to be a town with strong Democratic support, much of it tied to union workers, backed the Republican 53 to 41%, after strongly supporting Obama 4 years ago. The story was the same in Madison, Jay, Bucksport. All helped re-elect Obama 4 years ago. All went with Trump this time. It's hard not to think that jobs in the economy were driving that shift. Lisa Shardlow, who owns a barbershop in Mexico, knows that her success, like that of most businesses in town, is tied to the 115-year-old mill, now owned by the Canadian firm Catalyst, which she can see across the river from her parking lot. Gray-white smoke billows from its stacks. The smell of sulfur lingers. While she and her husband are doing okay financially, Shardlow cares about the economy and jobs because they affect her business too. But she also cares about healthcare. She didn't want to be forced to buy insurance, so she and her husband paid the tax penalty and rolled the dice. She worries about the flow of heroin into the United States because her 23-year-old son is an addict. He's in jail now for breaking into a house and stealing guns. It was her house. She's the one who turned him in. So I think we can see how Trump's perspective that things in America were already bad and getting worse, his railing on about trade deals and that had taken jobs overseas, resonated with the lived experience of people in Mexico and other towns like it in a way that America's already great just didn't. Go figure. So we're talking here about overwhelmingly white rural Maine towns that 4 years ago enthusiastically re-elected our nation's first black president, which was after 6 years of right-wing conspiracy theorists, including Donald Trump, flooding their televisions and newspapers with stories in an attempt to convince voters like them that Obama was a foreign-born Muslim with a forged birth certificate. And so I don't mean to suggest here that voting for a black president doesn't mean that, means that you don't hold racist ideas. And as someone who, having grown up in this area, I can tell you firsthand, a lot of people there hold racist ideas. But I think this is a matter of kind of wading through and having to understand what is kind of the underlying motivation here that drives this shift in support. These are places that saw their party, the supposed party of the working class, pay lip service to their plight on the campaign trail, only to have the bottom drop out from under their lives afterward. Places where people were begging for work and were offered welfare at best. So in Meaning of Marxism, which is an awesome book that we actually have a study group coming up on, which you can find out more about at the book table over here too after the meeting. Paul D'Amato writes, "The system is designed, the two-party system, so that when voters are dissatisfied with one party, there's always another one waiting in the wings that can take over with minimal disruption to the system as a whole. The Democrats' promises didn't come to fruition in Mexico. Trump's promises will not come to fruition there either. The truth is, neither of these corporate-funded parties has anything to offer these towns or working people anywhere." As Marxists, we see this not just as a crisis within the Democrat and Republican parties, though, let's be real, they are a fucking mess, but as a crisis innate to our economic system that we all live under, the system of capitalism. And crises like these will continue until capitalism is dismantled. Because underneath it all, we live in a system where decreased demand for a product leads the captains of industry to take their investments, factories, and jobs elsewhere. In Mexico, the demand for paper may be gone, but basic human needs remain unanswered. The only hope people are given is that perhaps they can elect the right politician, someone who can convince another company to open up shop, thus starting the whole process over again. Ever since kings and colonizers started privatizing the land, disrupting communal societies, the vast majority of people on this planet have had to rely on wage labor to survive. Going to work somewhere, tell me if this sounds familiar to you, selling your time and talents to some other person or organization who then compensates you with a paycheck. Wage labor traps most of us in a situation where you have to get up every day, go to a place you don't particularly like, do work that may be harmful to you and the planet, but at the same time, your life and the lives of people closest to you depend on it. This is at once a very real and very surreal dynamic that brings to mind workers in coal country, the workers advocating for the Dakota Access Pipeline to be built, and people up in Denmark, Maine, to use another local example, arguing in favor of handing their groundwater over to Nestle after a summer of dried up wells and crops because it might bring some jobs if a water processing plant comes in. The common sense ideology tells workers that their jobs and their lives are under threat by the influx of immigrants and other outsiders. But we argue that the strangling of mill towns is driven by the same forces that push migrants to risk their lives crossing oceans and borders. It is not the innate racism or inherent privilege of the white working class that leads them to fail to make this connection, but the ruling class's monopoly on mass media and education, along with a relatively low level of radical struggle to counter their propaganda, and that does so. Capitalism as a system is invested in driving the conditions of both groups down, sowing seeds of hate and mistrust, and casting these two groups lots together and then putting them at one another's throats. It's the conditions of capitalism that create room for the politics of fear, hate, and division. And whether we win the fight against these politics depends on our ability to mobilize against much more than just Trump and the Republican Party. So I want to return now to a premise that I laid out earlier, that while this past week has shown that ordinary people have an enormous political will to fight, that we don't fully understand our political power. And there's a growing understanding, I think, of the power of protest to create change and the power of social movements to create change. Black Lives Matter and the water protectors at Standing Rock have brought this to the fore. Police brutality was on the agenda, because thousands of people exerted their rage and their hope for a better world through mass mobilizations in the streets. That's the only reason that was put on the agenda. And the only reason that the Dakota Access Pipeline is not in the ground right now is because of the fight that Indigenous people have mounted there and the solidarity actions that have echoed back all around the world. As workers, though, we have an even more potent weapon in our hands, the power of the strike. By organizing labor, workers gain the leverage it takes to win demands from the bosses and the politicians by exercising our ability to shut down the source of their profits. When these struggles are at their height, strikes aren't just about shutting things down until we win those demands, but they become events where workers demonstrate their potential to restart society, to restart industry in their own interest. I've got another example from the book here that I wanted to share. In Seattle in 1919, almost all of the city's workers struck in solidarity with 35,000 longshore workers striking for higher pay. A strike committee was formed of elected representatives from each of the 101 striking union locals. The strike committee discussed not only issues of how to conduct the strike, but how to keep basic services running during the strike, like emergency health care and milk delivery. The general strike naturally raised the practical issues of workers' control of production and distribution. An editorial written by Anna Louise Strong on the eve of the strike expressed the potential. And she wrote, "Labor will not only shut down the industries, but labor will reopen under the management of the appropriate trades such activities as are needed to preserve public health and public peace. If the strike continues, labor may feel led to avoid public suffering by reopening more and more activities under its own management." The strike ended under pressure from conservative union leaders, but nevertheless, it posed an embryo of the question of who runs society and in what way. So I bring up strikes because protests, occupations, demonstrations, and marches, these things are going to be key in mitigating the damage of a Trump presidency. And it's essential that we join and organize and build events like these toward the immediate goal of protecting ourselves and those who will be most vulnerable under a Trump regime. They will play a role in obstructing his agenda, in cutting against the ideologies of hate and division. They'll show that we do not have to wait until after the midterm elections for leadership from above in order to fight back and to even win. But if we want to win real safety and full agency for all those who suffer from oppression and exploitation, we need to elevate our political practice beyond the protest model. In response to Trump's announcement that he will immediately deport 2 to 3 million undocumented immigrants, one of the most urgent demands that has emerged this week has been a call for cities to affirm or to enact sanctuary policies. And that's a demand that's being raised here in Portland. It's a really, really important demand. The socialist approach to this and how we want to tack on this is that we want to join the immediate struggle toward winning that demand, while simultaneously proposing that the idea of a sanctuary city should be expanded to its absolute fullest expression. And to that end, we ask, what would it really mean to make this city safe for immigrants? Safety comes from more than simply knowing that you or your loved ones won't be seized by the police in the middle of the night and disappeared into a detention center. It comes from knowing where your next meal is, that you have clean water to drink, that you have a warm bed and a roof over your head, that your children have places to play where they won't face harassment, from knowing that if you're ever harmed or fall ill, that you will receive professional quality health care. Then we must ask, what will it really take to make that safety a reality? Who shares these interests in those types of demands, in full access to food, housing, schooling, and health? What forces stand in our way of getting there? And most strategically, what forces on our side have the greatest amount of political will towards winning these demands and the political power to put up the fiercest fight? As socialists, we argue that the fight for sanctuary in our city and on this earth is a fight that pits the needs of ordinary people against the demands of profit. We also argue the most powerful weapon we have in that fight is a militantly organized, multiracial, multi-gender working class. Imagine a fight for sanctuary here in Portland that not only raises those demands through protest and petitions, but organizes workers to the point where no fucking lobster rolls are served in restaurants as long as deportation papers and eviction notices are served in the city. The socialist fight for sanctuary is one that unites workers and immigrants, not only on moral grounds, out of sympathy for each other's plight, but on the practical grounds that our interests are not divided by our social identities, and that overcoming these divisions is the only way that we will win. We have to acknowledge that right now, even with the upswing in protests, we are a long way from making that level of struggle a reality. Resistance may emerge spontaneously, but the fight will not win without serious organization. Concurrent with the fights already underway towards winning immediate demands, passing reforms, and protecting ourselves, we need serious organization towards uprooting the material conditions that give rise to crises like the ones that we're in now. Uprooting them and replacing them with a system based on meeting the needs of the many, not accumulating wealth for the few. That is a movement for socialism. And to build that movement, we need to start with people who want to resist now. We need to build a base of committed socialists dedicated to lifelong struggle against all forms of oppression and exploitation, ready to rise up when those struggles are at high points, and prepared to steel ourselves against feelings of confusion and isolation when the protests die down. We need a group of people committed to educating themselves about the history of movements, how they've won and how they've lost, studied in theories of liberation, practiced in arguing them and organizing around them, who can join and start struggles always with the explicit goal to elevate their consciousness, combativeness, and confidence. If you are here in this room tonight, you are someone who can become a leader in that fight, and I hope you'll join us.